Perfect. Well, hello everyone, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Prashasti and you've probably seen a lot of emails from me, but I'm really thrilled to welcome a fantastic group of panelists today who will lead us into a very important discussion on immigration and Black Lives Matter and Black liberation as part of the Immigration and Scholar series. And Immigration and is a new justice-oriented program that is open to everyone. And I dropped a link earlier in the chat that I'll do again so that you can kind of see some of our topics and some of our panelists that we will be engaging in these important conversations with. Today's space is a space of reflection and imagination. So we will start with welcoming our panelists and then be in conversation with them for about 50 minutes. And we will then end with some resources that I'll also send in a follow-up email. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, I'll hand it over to the incredible Nabintou, who is also the lead submissions editor for the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal, and will be moderating our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Prashasti, not only for introducing me, but also I think just for like this wonderful series. I was just telling her how amazing it's been just to follow the Immigration and series and how excited I am for today's conversation in particular. This is a conversation that's particularly important and personal to me as a first-generation American by way of Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa. Both of my parents immigrated from the Ivory Coast, and so I'm really excited to just be able to dive into this discussion with our amazing panelists. And with that, I'll just make space for each of the panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. And Professor McKanders, if you're okay, we can get started with you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I am impressed that your journal is having this conversation. And I am a professor at Vanderbilt Law School, where I run the immigration clinic. And I have been for over the course of my career writing on anti-Black racism and its intersection with immigration.
Thank you so much. Breanne, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Hi, everyone. My name is Breanne Palmer. Pronouns are she, hers. I'm a Georgetown Law School alum, so it's very exciting to be joining you all and seeing how much more radical the journals have become since I left. It's very exciting. I'm also a first-generation American of Jamaican descent, first one born in the US, and I currently work at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and my passion issue is Black immigration issues and figuring out what kind of transformational solidarity we can build between Black American communities and Black immigrant communities, because the only way we're going to achieve liberation. So thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be with my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Breanne. And Melissa, if you want to close us out.
Sure, thank you. And I'm so happy to be here today with all of you, to be in community and for this conversation, and excited to be here with my fellow panelists. My name is Melissa Johnson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a British-born Jamaican migrant, a proud Brooklyn resident. I'm also the new organizer at BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. BAJI is the largest Black-led and racial justice organization, Black-led racial justice and immigrant rights organization in the US. We focus on educating, advocating, organizing on behalf of Black communities and particularly Black migrants. We see the connection between racial justice and immigration inherently connected as part of the same struggle for racial and social justice. And we work with both Black migrants and African Americans to further advocate for racial, social, and economic justice on behalf of all Black people, particularly the liberation of all Black people. So excited to be here and in conversation with everyone. And my passion project as a Jamaican migrant is continuing to work on behalf of Black migrants and Black communities to ensure the liberation of all Black people. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you to all of our panelists again for your introductions. Again, just like Prashasti mentioned, and extensive introductions are also in the chat if you want to go ahead and check them out. Yeah, and I guess at this time we can jump right into the conversation with just, I think, setting the tone as we think about how immigration is a Black issue. And so I think we can just like begin the discussion by spending some time really just centering Black voices within immigration and the anti-Blackness that's perpetuated by the immigration apparatus. So the first question that I'll throw out to all of our panelists is, what are important histories and moments for us to remember as we just grapple with further understanding the state of Black immigration right now, and how are movements for immigration justice and BLM connected? And we can feel free to go in any particular order, but Breanne, if you want to get us started.
Sure, I was actually going to defer to Professor and Melissa, but I can give my thoughts, my brief thoughts first. I think one of the phenomenons that I think is most nuanced and most interesting is trying to create solidarity between Black American communities and Black immigrant communities without pretending as though our experiences are exactly the same, but also recognizing that both of our communities experience anti-Black racism in the US in particular. So I feel like there's a very sort of careful, tender mission in trying to find ways that we are similar and experiences that we do share, while also recognizing that Black immigrants don't necessarily have the same experiences lived and otherwise in their home countries as Black Americans have in the US. And I think it's important, one of the ways to kind of support that mission is to remember that at many points in history, in Black American history in particular, many of our most kind of lauded, celebrated Black American civil rights icons were first generation or second generation Americans. Many folks were descendants of American folks who were enslaved, but some were more recent immigrants or children of immigrants. And so I think that there's a lot of history that we are still uncovering and realizing how long Black immigrants have been contributing to Black American movements. And we should look to that as inspiration for what we're doing today. And that our experiences are different in very significant ways, but we have much more to gain by recognizing those differences and creating solidarity that acknowledges our differences, but also builds upon the fact that we are all trying to survive anti-Blackness. And so I think that there's a lot of history to be mined and to be uncovered, but that history can really inspire what we're doing today. And I think I don't see any way that the immigrant justice movement can succeed if we don't address the inherent anti-Blackness in many of our immigration spaces. And I think that Black Lives Matter also, it has been doing a good job of this for a number of years, is beginning to integrate Black immigrant issues, beginning to integrate Abolish ICE into the BLM platform. I think that there's a lot of interesting energy being created, and I want that to keep going. So that's where I'll start.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much, Breanne. I think for me personally, like really connect with the part you mentioned about how, for many of us, a lot of this history is one that we're still learning and still uncovering ourselves. And so, I would like to, I guess, invite you at this time, Professor McKanders, to sort of just walk us through some of those, some of that history as we think more about it and connect that. And then Melissa, of course, feel free to jump in as well.
I think that when we're teaching our, foundational immigration laws, it's important to understand that the initial, immigration and naturalization laws were founded on a Black-white binary. So if we look at the 1970 naturalization law, it was limited to free white males. We understand that our immigration laws are part and parcel of America's racialized project. And we look at, the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, where the Supreme Court Justice Taney said that in failing to or not wanting to acknowledge the rights of individuals who were Black, says that the white man is not bound to respect any rights of the Black man and citizenship rights. So I think we have to start from those foundational laws in which our immigration system simply furthered a Black-white binary. If we're looking at initial naturalization cases, we see in Ozawa, one of the foundational cases, where an individual was arguing, a Japanese national was arguing that they were of a white ethnicity, so they could be naturalized. We also saw that in those cases, the judges were constructing race and not going with scientific evidence on race, which we know race is a social construction, but in the language of those Supreme Court cases, we see judges saying that we're going to go with a common knowledge understanding of what constitutes a race. And so I think we have to, in understanding how immigration enforcement operates today, we have to understand those foundations from which the laws come from. And understanding that, it helps us to contextualize what's going on today and understand that, when we see, immigration enforcement at the border and we see Title 42 closing the southern border, that's just part and parcel of systemic racism in the United States. And it's not an aberration from racism creating this Black-white binary. So I think that the question is really, really important, because we always have to go back to contextualizing history and how what's going on today is a part of a larger system in which anti-Blackness and racism is operating.
Thank you, Professor McKanders. And I think as we think about both of those two things and obviously the intersections that exist between them, right? So recognizing that there's this larger movement where like all Black people work together, and then also contextualizing that in history. I'm immediately drawn, I think, to like your work, Melissa, and a lot of the, work that Baji does in particular. And so if you want to speak specifically, first off, feel free to answer any of the questions, but if you also want to touch on just how these two movements are connected. So with like Black Lives Matter, and then, the fight for just immigration, and what that looks like and how that comes up in your work.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. And thank you, Professor McKanders, for your thoughtful response as well. And I just appreciate the opportunity to center Black voices and call out anti-Blackness in the discussion of immigration and immigrant rights, because it's a part of a larger challenge to the history of racial equity and human rights in this country. So we can't begin to delve into a true and accurate understanding of immigration as a practice, a policy, and a debate without acknowledging the history of slavery and the violent practices of slave catching as racist appendages of oppression and dehumanization of Black people, right? These legalized practices set the stage for a foundational influence on immigration as a process that has historically sought to limit the access, opportunity, and freedom of Black people entering this country, of Black people entering this country. We know it has evolved over time to impact the rights of all migrants of color. However, this foundational response in centering Blackness as a way to dispel, to dehumanize, and oppress starts at the beginning of our history. Additionally, the current immigration conversation must include the work and also the victories of the civil rights movement, which sought to combat history of enslavement of Black people, segregation, and inequality, with social, political, and legal efforts to overturn the legalized white supremacy, and all led by Black and Black immigrant communities. So we're seeing work historically from Black and Black immigrant communities to challenge the history of racism, to overturn legalized white supremacy, and also think about Blackness in a larger context. Right? So this allows us to situate the evolution of immigration as both the responsive tool of white supremacy and the white supremacist state to suppress migration, population, and the rights of Black and brown migrants in this country and those who are trying to enter, while also recognize it as a part of a larger historical struggle for racial justice led by Black people, including Black migrants. So in the initial question, immigration has always been a Black issue because it's always been a part of a historical struggle for racial and social justice. And with the movement for migrant justice and Black lives, we're seeing more of a coherent understanding in this point, but it has historically always been a movement for the liberation of all Black people. So I think what we're seeing now is more of an evolution in the way that we speak about the connection to this work and speak about the historical movement for this work, and also call out the anti-Blackness that has always existed in this, this process and this practice.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good segue as we're thinking about, I mean, like just like the unique position that Black immigrants have within both of these movements, right? And so one of the areas that immediately comes to mind is, the disproportionate criminalization of Black immigrants that, we know exists and that we're continuing to just like learn more about. And I think just for us, it's obviously just difficult to have this conversation without acknowledging the ongoing display of anti-Black racism that exists at the border and just in the general criminalization of Black immigrants who often experience a double punishment. And so, with that in mind and kind of connected to the conversation that we're already having, I'd love to hear just like more of the panelists' thoughts around the different mechanisms that exist in which Black immigrants face that or experience that double punishment, and how Black immigrants in particular are criminalized within the immigration system. And yeah, I guess either Melissa or Breanne, if you want to get us started, that works.
I can start us off, and I know Melissa will fill in any blanks that I accidentally leave. I think that I can speak at least to the asylum process most expertly. Black immigrants, like Black Americans, we have an additional pipeline, right? There's the prison to ICE to detention to deportation pipeline for Black immigrants. Black immigrants are perceived as Black in the US. And so whether it's a traffic stop, search, we are targeted just as Black Americans are by police and other law enforcement agencies. And once we have that experience, there's the additional punishment of then being, in many cases, transferred over into ICE custody. And then after that, there are a number of indignities and harms that Black immigrants face while being processed through the immigration system, and then potentially deported to their home countries, or in other cases to countries that they've never been to. So we experience the anti-Black racism that Black Americans do, and then we have an additional kind of phase of harm and hurt that happens after that. I think you may have heard of 287G programs where local police departments will partner with ICE to say, let's say they stop someone on the street, a Black immigrant. They hold them in the county jail for a certain amount of time. They'll hold them even longer to allow ICE to determine if that person is in their system. And in many cases, they will hand that person over directly to ICE. So we have domestic law enforcement agencies, whether they are local or under the umbrella of DHS, working together to perform anti-Blackness on any Black person, regardless of their ethnicity. When it comes to the asylum system, Black immigrants face higher levels of asylum denials. We're often not seen as deserving of asylum and protection. We're often not seen as refugees or immigrants or asylum seekers. Those titles are not often in like the kind of common imagination. They don't apply to Black people, even though we all know that Black immigrants exist. We receive higher rates of bond amounts to get freed from ICE detention if we are detained. It's just at every single stage and step of the immigration apparatus, there are disproportionate harms faced by Black people because, like Professor McKanders has written about, anti-Blackness is foundational to the American system and especially to our immigration system. And so it's a complicated maze for any immigrant to kind of make their way through, but it's especially treacherous for people who are perceived as Black. And so there's no way that we can reform, remake, reimagine any type of policing without including the immigration enforcement system in that reimagination, in that abolition, if that's where folks are. There's just no way to divorce those two systems from one another because they are incestuous, they feed into one another, they copy their tactics, they are one and the same. And so I think it's an especially tough situation that Black immigrants are in should they encounter domestic police or ICE. It is almost always a negative experience. And so I'll hand it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Breanne, for your comments. I couldn't agree more. And I would just continue to add that as a Black immigrant and as the New York organizer for BAJI, working on behalf of Black migrants and Black migrant communities, we face a unique experience of being both Black first and also immigrant, as well as the other identities that we hold, whether they be our gender identity, our religious identity, the multiple Afro-diasporic languages that we speak from the Caribbean to Central and South America, and then across the African continent, to also disabilities and other identities that we hold. So we sit at an intersection of identity that is complicated and complex simultaneously, and that is not monolithic in any way. And I think that's an important part to situate an understanding of Black migrants. And then to say, because of our Blackness, we historically have been involved, have situated ourselves and live amongst Black people because of the safety that Black communities provide, and because of the similarity and the experience of Blackness that we have in America. And in those Black communities where Black folks, whether they are African American or Black migrants, are living together, we know that Black communities are already heavily surveilled, heavily policed, heavily targeted, and heavily harassed by police and by the state authority. We know that the relationship between police and ICE has been historic and long, and has continued that historic policy and practice of surveilling, catching, entrapping, and dehumanizing Black people, including Black migrants. So we see a continued relationship of police and ICE sharing information about Black migrants through the targeting and surveillance. We also know that because Black communities are highly policed, that we're seeing the first point of contact in police be within our very own neighborhoods, our blocks and our streets, that we live, that we work, and that we have our families every day. And this is important to understand, that this first contact of police puts us in a funnel, to be in a funnel in the larger deportation system. For Black migrants, that first contact with police puts us in a position where we're not only racially profiled because we're Black, but then we're eligible to be put in city and state jails and prisons, and then transferred into immigrant detention and then deported. And that is the deportation funnel and the machine that we're seeing so largely and so uniquely impact Black migrants, all because we are Black first. Additionally, we understand that immigration from internally in the US to the southern border also shows us the inherent anti-Blackness that affects us uniquely, whether it's Black migrants being, rejected asylum at the border, or Black migrants in immigrant detention centers being abused, tortured, and violently treated, or neglected of human rights, basic human rights necessities, all because we are Black. We also know that Black migrants lead the cause in talking about the violent practices of the immigration system most loudly, most fiercely, and involve others in the conversation too, which is a unique experience that Black migrants have to endure and hold that burden. We also know that this process of speaking out also criminalizes folks who are in the space trying to live, trying to work, and just trying to survive and make a home in this country. So we're seeing various points of, continued penalization and criminalization of Black migrants in the process of detention, deportation, and the entire criminality of the system.
Thank you so much, Breanne and Melissa. I think just for those extremely clear examples as well, because I think sometimes when we are having conversations around the heightened criminalization of Black immigrants, it can just tend to almost feel, or I think be perceived as this very general concept, when in reality it is very specific, I think, as you both laid out. And I think right before we turn to you, Professor McKanders, Haddy has actually hopped on. So I do want to give her an opportunity to introduce herself. Welcome, Haddy, so excited to have you. If you want to just take a minute or so to introduce yourself, and then I can just catch you up on where we are in the conversation.
Sure, that sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name is Haddy Gassama, and I serve as the Policy and Advocacy Director for the UndocuBlack Network. UndocuBlack is a multi-generational network of currently and formerly undocumented Black immigrants. And we do everything from federal legislative and administrative advocacy work to media and narrative work to community engagement and wellness work. Really grateful to be here, and huge apologies for my tardiness. It has been a whirlwind of a couple of days. So apologies, I was stuck on another call and actually thought that this one started at 1, but looking forward to the conversation.
No worries. Thank you so much for joining. We're really excited to have you on. And just sort of, I guess, to catch you up so far, we're really just talking a lot about historically contextualizing and centering immigration as a Black issue. And now we're speaking specifically to the disproportionate criminalization that Black immigrants face. And in light of that second piece, I think turning to you, Professor McKanders, I guess I'm just curious to know more about what this looks like from a pedagogical standpoint, as the founding director of the Immigration Practice Clinic at Vanderbilt. I guess I think I'm just curious to know how that intersection of, Black identity, but also how that's like criminalized exists and is particularly important to make sure that it's being represented when you are fighting for rights of Black immigrants in particular, such as in an asylum clinic.
Mm-hmm. I think, there are immigration clinics that focus on, they're called crimmigration clinics that focus specifically on crimmigration issues. So first, I'm going to address the criminality and how the law criminalizes Black immigrants. And then the second part, what can we do in our praxis to address this issue? And so just to give you a little bit of background, the criminalization of Black immigrants is tied to 1996, when there were two different laws that were passed, the Anti-Terrorism Death Penalty Act, AEDPA, and the Illegal Immigration and Reform and Responsibility Act. That act specifically enlarged the crimes that you commit or conduct that you could commit that would make you deportable from the United States. And that was passed under and led by President Bill Clinton. And that also increased the instances where you could be subject to mandatory detention. And so that was the start of what we see, like, this increase in the prison to deportation pipeline that disproportionately impacts Black immigrants. Then we see, under another administration, Obama, focusing in on felons, not families, which also kind of heightens the deportation to prison pipeline. And then certainly under the previous administration, we saw the deportation of immigrants of African descent, Black immigrants, more than doubling for Somali nationals. I think it was a 200% increase in deportations under the Trump administration. And so I highlight that, 1996 law and the different administrations, because often we have the idea that there's one, administration that does better than others on, enforcement. However, each president is operated within a system and context where we have to go back to that history in terms of how the system operates and how it disproportionately impacts Black immigrants. There's a study that I cite in an article that I just wrote, and it's by a sociologist named Tanya Golash-Banza, and she does kind of semi-ethnographic work with Jamaican nationals who were placed in the prison to deportation pipeline. And I think that's a good kind of pedagogical piece to read to kind of understand the impact of the 1996 laws. Also, I think in terms of the ways in which we advocate, and this connects to the second part of the question with clinical work, there is, I think, a little bit of a movement. We saw last year a judge out of, I believe it was Arizona, Judge Dew, issuing an opinion where she specifically cites the racist foundations of the laws that criminalize unlawful re-entry into the United States, and was successful in bringing up the history, the racist history, racist foundations of the criminalizing unlawful reentry. Now, I believe that's a start in the ways in which we are understanding how immigration has this racist foundation. It's a tiny start, but I think it's a place to begin. Whether that would extend to the other immigration laws, I think, legally doubtful. But I think it's aligned with the trend that we see in qualified immunity cases, where we see judges issuing opinions that are saying that, the foundational laws are based in racism, and therefore the enforcement that is occurring today is also, part and parcel of that system. And so what is the praxis? I think we always have to go back to the praxis. And, there are two different things, and I'll make this short. I think that there's addressing your client in the moment when they're in a crisis moment, and then there's systemic reform. And so, the clinic that I teach has represented individuals who are detained, and we've represented, immigrants of African descent that don't have access to interpreters, don't have language access, which really significantly impacts their ability to navigate access to counsel, access to being able to talk to, the ICE officers, or ICE officers harassing people, expecting them to speak Spanish when they come from, another country. They speak Lingala, they speak different dialects, and, giving them incorrect information. And so I think that, when I work with my students, we work on a systemic level, and then we also work with, how can we help the individual that's in front of us that is up against these systems that are, turning against them. And as Breanne mentioned, with the statistics, it often seems impossible when you are in front of an individual immigration judge or an ICE officer. So I think the work has to come on both levels with your clients, and then, the work that Baji is doing specifically in providing information, writing reports. I use those reports all the time in my practice. And so I think it's, both and when we're thinking about the individual client and systemic reform.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor McKanders. I, for one, am like totally nerding out right now. I think Prashasti is doing such a great job dropping the links in the chat, and I can't wait to just like put them in into Google and get a chance to catch up on all of this information. It's just like such great information and information like overload in the best way possible. So thank you. I think especially for just like centering the historical context of it and continuously bringing it back to that, I think is really helpful. And I think as everyone is sort of just like discussing, one of the things that it's making me think about is really how I think when it comes to criminalization of Black immigrants in particular, a lot of times it can be easy to really reduce it to this very like everyday one-on-one situation that sometimes just tends to happen, which is, obviously we know how the conversation with regards to police brutality tends to exist as well. And so I think one of the things, at least for me, that I'm learning is really that, these are issues that are deeply embedded within our American legal systems. And the fact that they manifest in our laws, in our immigration laws in particular, is not by chance, right? It's actually very intentional. And so I think in thinking about those, to turn it to you, Haddy, especially with, in light of the fact that so much of your work exists around policy and advocacy, I'm curious to know what resistance looks like from that angle, especially considering that a lot of this work is really destabilizing so many of these things that are deeply embedded and like stubbornly so.
Yeah, I think one of the key pieces in resistance is first like outright naming the anti-Blackness that is inherent in all of these systems, that is inherent in all of these laws, and acknowledging it. Even now, when a lot of my work, as you mentioned, revolves around pushing for legislative laws to come out or policies, a lot of times when any piece of legislation comes out that is immigration related, it is still bound to those 1996 laws. So it leaves so many members of our communities ineligible to actually benefit from, these otherwise seemingly great programs or provisions that are going on. I mean, I think of HR 6, for example, which, our organization very much championed, but we also had to hold in the same space, sort of that both and that Professor McKanders was talking about, where we are on the one hand supporting for legislative reform, but on the other hand, acknowledging that if this thing were to pass, it still has written within it and also within just immigration law, separate from the legislation, these criminal bars that disproportionately render Black immigrants ineligible. I think another thing to know is also just the way in which anti-Blackness is embedded in these systems, and even just the assumption of culpability or guilt or fraud that comes into play when folks are applying for, say, asylum or other pieces of immigration relief. One thing that we note a lot at UndocuBlack is how it oftentimes feels like asylum officers, immigration judges, and whomever else are really not even familiar with the fact patterns that Black immigrants bring. They might be familiar with a certain type of political instability in Central America. If it's just a straight kind of U visa or gender related sort of thing, they might understand that. But if someone from a country they're unfamiliar with, like say the Gambia, my own home country, that suffered a 22-year brutal dictatorship that was ongoing up until the past few years. If the asylum officer or the immigration judge has no context of that information, it's not even within their realm, and they're also already projecting their own inherent anti-Black sort of racist notions to what Black asylum seekers look like, the chances of someone getting asylum with that kind of story is far lower, or at least the evidentiary threshold will be much, much higher than their, say, white counterpart. We're seeing that play out even as we talk about the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict. It's this idea of not being able to see a certain level of humanity, a certain level of need within Black migrants that they would see elsewhere. And it is, as I said, endemic in the system. I'm sure Breanne and Melissa and Dr. McKanders or Professor McKanders did a wonderful job of explaining sort of the backstory around this and the racist origins within any really system of enforcement. And so immigration is not exempt from that. But I think within our work, I would say the first step is just naming that this sort of white supremacist, white nationalist, and anti-Blackness exists at every single level of the immigration system. And if we are to pass anything or provide any form of relief or benefits to our members and Black immigrants at large, that has to be tackled like right on.
No, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Haddy. And thank you for highlighting, I think, and centering, obviously what's going on in Ukraine right now. That was definitely my next question. We got to shake it up a little bit, if that's okay. And so, yeah, I think a lot of times something that can definitely serve as a conversation stopper, unsurprisingly, when we were trying to talk about a conversation like Black immigration, is really just oppression Olympics, right? I think a lot of times people can sort of reduce these very complex issues to the fact that it's almost as if to suggest that one group is experiencing something worse, when I think in reality, at least for me, it's highlighting the differences in those experiences and also pointing to the fact that it's very intentional that those differences exist. And this is, the conversation on Ukraine is one that I've obviously been seeing and have been a part of, and really want to just go off of you, Haddy, and take some time, I think, to really just like highlight that and get all of, to those who are open to it, your reflections and your thoughts. I mean, I think, we all know that it was just less than 6 months ago when we saw Haitians at the border, being just completely abused by Border Patrol. And the White House response that we saw was Dear Biden telling us that they were going to abolish use of whips, which, that's great. So But I think on the other end, what we see is really, you know, regardless of whether any sort of formal response or anything has been formally put in place yet, just the White House response that we see right now is different, right? We see like a commitment to, or a willingness to put something specific down to welcome refugees from Ukraine. And, you know, I don't think it's a surprise to any of us that that is very different than when we do see so many issues that are happening to Black immigrants, if we hear about those issues in the States at all. And so, you know, I think, Haddy, if you're comfortable, you know, jumping right back in and getting us started on this conversation, but I think just in general, like hearing more of, you know, your thoughts and your reflections around those sorts of issues and how that's just an important part of the conversation when we're talking about Black immigration and its uniqueness.
Yeah. One thing we say, unfortunately, too often at UndocuBlack is that we are heartbroken, but not shocked, or we are, you know, disappointed, but not shocked. And I think with the situation of Black migrants attempting to flee the conflict in Ukraine, it is the same thing. It is unfortunate and frustrating at its deepest level, but again, not shocking. As we all know, anti-Blackness is unfortunately universal, and it plays out, and at times can get, the dial on it can get heightened even in the most dire of situations. And that's what we're seeing play out in Ukraine. I think it's important to note that all of the accounts from Black migrants that we are seeing or hearing right now explain that it is not necessarily Polish Border Patrol or Romanian Border Patrol or Hungarian Border Patrol that is prohibiting them from crossing into safety. It is the Ukrainian Border Patrol on the Ukrainian side before they get to the safe zone or the new country that is prohibiting them and telling them to go to the back of the line, if you will. And even that line of going back to, you know, going back to the back of the line is so triggering and is so historically, I guess, just rich in all sorts of anti-Black racism, whether it is in the United States or elsewhere. That idea that because you are Black, you are automatically deprioritized for safety. I mean, we've heard accounts where trains are being instructed to allow women and children to go on there because Ukraine has instated martial law where all men from the age of 18 to 60 have to stay behind and, I guess, fight in the conflict. But Black babies and Black women are being told they cannot get on these trains taking them to safe zones. Those things are very connected to what we're seeing here in the US in the southern border. We've seen Black migrants be stuck under bridges and in makeshift shelters as a result of MPP, or abruptly expelled out of the US and back to dangerous conditions as a result of Title 42. And so I think for those of us in the Black immigrant community, we made those connections fairly quickly. I can say what has been taxing these last 2 days, and even in the meeting that I came out of before this, is having to do that extra labor of connecting those dots to other advocates, to other government officials, to congressional offices where, for whatever reason, it's just not as obvious. Again, because, you know, our needs and our humanity, for whatever reason, does not come top of mind or is not obvious. I think from UndocuBlack's perspective, what I would say is that any immigrants' rights organization or the Biden administration or congressional offices that have anything to say about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, while they are rightfully so advocating for protections of Ukrainian nationals in the US not to be deported back to Ukraine, and also having conversations around welcoming potential Ukrainian refugees, you cannot in good faith and in good moral do that without also acknowledging the harm that has been inflicted upon Black migrants also trying to flee Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Haddy. And I guess at this time, I'll just open it up. And if anyone else had additional reflections that you wanted to add as part of this conversation or this question in particular?
I think what helps me make sense of a Del Rio crisis last September and then seeing what's happening in the Ukraine is remembering that one of the questions, Prashasti and Nabintou, that you posed was, where do Black immigrants fall in the racialized hierarchy in the US? And I think it's obvious that we are very much at the bottom of that list in the US. We're both invisible, and we are also kind of overly publicly targeted for harm, right? So if we think of the Del Rio crisis, Haitian migrants, other African migrants, they're not the only folks kind of gathering at the border, seeing if there's some way to get around Title 42, but which group of people is subjected to extreme and visceral violence? It's the Black immigrants, right? And then in the Ukraine, I think that in general, what is so hard for people to understand is that, why are African students and families in the Ukraine in the first place? Are they Black immigrants? That idea that Black immigrants exist outside of the US and in other places is very hard for the general public to wrap their minds around. And so people don't understand that Black immigrants exist in these European spaces. So they're invisibilized. But then, as we're seeing, as Haddy described graphically, we are seeing that they are being prioritized last. They are not being treated as deserving of protection, asylum, and other, one could say anyone in the Ukraine right now is a potential refugee, but the Black folks who live there, who are studying or residing there, are not being categorized that way. So again, we are ignored, and then we are singled out for specific harm. And that dynamic helps me make sense of these types of things. It helps me understand that when it's convenient, we don't exist. And then when it's time to kind of make examples of certain types of immigrants, or to use tried and true anti-immigrant, anti-Black tactics, Black immigrants are going to be the target of that. And I think that's one of the most helpful, if depressing, dynamics that I can think of to help me wrap my mind around kind of world issues where Black immigrants or Black folks who are away from their homes are subject to specific and special treatment. And I wanted to echo Haddy and UndocuBlack's call for nuance in our statements. We can denounce what's happening in the Ukraine while also criticizing what the Ukrainian government is doing to Black residents in the Ukraine right now. I think those two things can and must be done together. And I just want to echo that call.
Yeah, thank you so much, both Haddy and Breanne. And I think, just to your points about erasure and how that continues to exist. And as we unfortunately begin to close off, we definitely want to end. And I think Professor McKanders, you highlighted this very well on an action note, right? And the fact that these are not just things, for starters, that exist just because, but that they're very intentional and very deeply embedded. And in that same way, they're things that can be undone and disrupted. And so, I'm thinking about that, and in thinking specifically about building solidarity, if each of the panelists, I think, could just answer this question, how do you envision movements for Black liberation and in immigration justice combining resources? And so, for us here, many of whom are law students, what do you think is the starting point for that kind of work that, obviously each of you are involved in different ways? And Melissa, if you want, we can go ahead and get started with you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think just to respond to both the erasure of Black migrants and the Black migrant narrative, and also building solidarity, we have to understand, or we have to start by understanding the global campaign for anti-Blackness has been a historical, cultural, social, economic, political project that has long been successful in ensuring that Blackness, wherever present, is denied, rejected, disenfranchised, and suppressed. And simultaneously, the effort by Black immigrants to ensure that their humanity, that their life experiences and their narrative is not, eliminated from the history of our understanding of humanity, and this attempt to try to understand a more multicultural understanding is a resistance effort for the liberation of not just Black people, but for all people to exist, and also to live to have the opportunity to live and have access to the quality of life that we all want. So I think the purpose of erasure has been working and has been set up to exist to limit that liberation, but also in building solidarity around that to combat those efforts to eliminate our narrative. As I start off saying that the liberation of Black people and immigrant justice, I think, has more been coalescing due to the efforts of BAJI and UndocuBlack and other Black immigrant organizations who inherently see the connection and the historical significance of racial justice and immigration justice or migrant rights as a project for humanity and for human rights. And I see more of this work being done at the local level, right? We know that the efforts of Black communities to resist efforts to limit our civic engagement, our engagement in electoral politics, our engagement in how our cities and our states are set up is also part of the significant experience and reality of Black migrants, as we are too participating and contributing to both Black culture and American culture. And so understanding that is already happening and also contributing and investing in and supporting with our time, our volunteerism, and our knowledge and resources and support to local level efforts and grassroots movements who are working on issues of language access, housing justice, civic engagement, ensuring folks have the ability and the right to vote. I know here in New York, we've just passed the city council legislation that enables more migrants who have green cards the ability to vote, ensuring that we have that opportunity and our communities are engaged around that so we can change local level city and state policies that negatively and uniquely affect Black migrants is important. And I see that work as a place to begin, to support the organizations and the efforts and the individuals who are doing that work, and to also understand how anti-Blackness is inherently perpetuated within all of these systems.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melissa. Professor McKanders, I'll turn to you next.
We, as lawyers, future lawyers and law students, have to think about the promise and the limitations of the law. We have to understand how the law has been a part of reifying racial hierarchy in the United States. And so that comes with this idea of, how do I, as a lawyer, take my cues from UndocuBlack? How do I take my cues from BAJI and listening to, the community that's impacted, and then asking the question, listening first and foremost, and then asking the question, how can I use some of the tools that I have as a lawyer to assist, BAJI and UndocuBlack? And I think that is, the essential task of a lawyer in the ways in which you operate and work with your clients. And I also think that as lawyers, we have to be cautious about thinking that the asylum system, I think everybody echoed here today that it has its problems, but what are the reductive narratives that I might be arguing in order to get my client relief? How do I have to place my client in a position where they are demanding from the United States government, placing themselves in the victim narrative in order to be granted asylum? And so I think you have to be, as a future attorney and attorney, conscious of the ways in which the law and your legal advocacy can be, again, part and parcel of a larger system. And I think bringing that consciousness to your representation and also becoming a listener with the organizations that you're working with your clients is, an important step for lawyers to take.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor McKanders. I think that piece or some of like your advice hits for me personally. I think you first come to law school, obviously different ways, different reasons. And I think at least for me, learning the fact that a lawyer can argue anything and anything is possible is the scariest thing in the world, because you realize how so much damage has been done to the world with that. And I think as I'm nearing the end of my law school career, I'm like, okay, but maybe that could be empowering in other ways. Like maybe we don't have to do bad things with that. Breanne, I'll turn to you next on the solidarity and like resource question.
Nabintou, and agree. Law school is a radicalizing experience in many ways. So in terms of how I see solidarity between Black Lives Matter and immigrant justice movements, I'm a big history nerd, and I think the key to the solidarity that I know is coming and will come in the future, it starts with uncovering some of the Black immigrant threads and histories within the Black American history that we already know, and in many cases don't know. I think that there are models of transformational solidarity that already exist in the ancestors that we have, and we can use those people as examples to expand on the work that we're doing now. If I think of Sidney Poitier, for example, right? He was not a Black American, but he contributed so much to the civil rights movement and the kind of way that Black people were portrayed on screen. That's just one example of many that I think it's really key for us to hold on to our individual identities, but also understand that our solidarity requires that we lift one another up and join in to the folks who are like us. And I also think that it's vital for our movements and for our communities to liberate ourselves from a scarcity mindset. The idea that there's not enough justice to go around, there's not enough reparations to go around, there's not enough healing to go around. White supremacy owes Black immigrants and Black Americans literally everything. They owe us all of it. And so we can and should demand all of it. And we should join our voices together to make those demands irresistible. And so those are just some of the ways I think that our solidarity is starting to grow, and it will continue to grow in the future if we keep those things in mind, that we've already been in solidarity before, and we should continue to do that and not splinter off. That's going to weaken our community building, and that's going to weaken the justice that we deserve and should be demanding.
Thank you so much, Breanne. And Haddy, if you want to close us out.
Yeah, certainly. And I will actually also piggyback off of what Breanne said, particularly around the historical solidarity pieces. I think it's really, really important to note and highlight that the ways in which our communities have been attacked are also go hand in hand in tandem. When we talk about the 1996 crimmigration laws, for example, those followed the 1994 crime bills that Clinton also passed. First you criminalize Black US citizens, and then you take it one step further and criminalize Black immigrants. When we talk about the Black immigrant or just immigrants' rights, call for citizenship in general and pathways to citizenship, it's important to note that Black folks who were born in this country were not immediately provided citizenship. There's a rich history of advocacy and legal activism to ensure that Black people in this country were able to become citizens. And so I think when we look at even those histories of the ways in which white supremacy has attacked our populations, you can't deny that, whether it's the Black immigrant struggle or the African-American struggle, it's really two sides of the same coin. I think related to that, what I will also say is that we cannot reform our way out of this. We cannot divest our way out of this. We had a really good conversation with Baji last night about this same topic. And I think I'd be remiss not to mention the serious need for abolitionist thinking. And this is me speaking as someone who works in federal policy. And I understand the importance of like incremental gains and incremental wins and trying to, step by step, do what we can to protect our communities. But I think the long-term visionary solution to all of this is really eradicating the system altogether. When we talk about Ukraine and what's going on there, it's the existence of borders altogether that has created this conflict and this idea that you have to control who can move where and how. All of that is rooted in white supremacy. And it is so interlinked and endemic in all of these systems that there is no real way of reforming it without completely just abolishing it altogether. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Haddy. Thank you to all of our panelists. Anyone who knows me, my family and friends who are on the call knows that I could be here for the next 12 hours and not get tired of this conversation. This is really just like my bread and butter. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope that this is just like the start of and like the continuation of such an important conversation that honestly is just not centered enough. I'd like to quickly shout out Prashasti for just creating this space. And on that note, I'd like to also remind everyone that the next Immigration and, which will be Immigration and AAPI Justice, is on March 7th. So if you haven't RSVP'd yet, please go do that. And then I guess just finally check out all of the great resources that were dropped in the chat, which is exactly what I plan on doing afterwards. But yeah, other than that, thank you all so much to the panelists for joining, obviously to our audience. Wishing you all a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you.
Bye.